Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Today, I've got Robert with me, Kirk, and Mark. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. The main topic of discussion today is, of course, the ruling in the case brought by South Africa against Israel at the International Court of Justice concerning genocide. Just for anyone who didn't catch the Daily Objective just beforehand, which was also about this or isn't too familiar, this isn't the final ruling. That's probably going to be years and years away about whether Israel actually has committed genocide in the eyes of the court. This is an interim ruling, which is about bringing in the sort of emergency interim measures against Israel. And I want to hear from everyone what they think about it, but just to kind of lay the groundwork, um, the court basically ruled that they are going to bring in interim measures, but these aren't the interim measures which South Africa wanted. So South Africa wanted an immediate ceasefire to be brought in. It was not enforceable, even if they did rule that way. But the interim measures they've recommended, in effect, are that Israel has to make sure that they're not committing genocide, and they have to make sure that they're not hiding any evidence of committing genocide, right? So not a victory for South Africa, but certainly not a victory for Israel either, I think. Mark, I'll come to you first and we'll go around. What do you think of the ruling?
Well, as usual, the international community is holding Israel to an impossible standard and putting them in an impossible moral dilemma. Gaza is one of the most populated regions on Earth. It is literally impossible to distinguish it's quote unquote innocent citizens from combatants in a place like that, particularly when the vast majority of the citizen population actually supports, aids, and abets the militants and are sometimes part of that militia group. So that they can't quote unquote kill babies, which is quite honestly not their goal. Their goal is to stop Hamas and to stop this murderous ideology and government from invading them, massacring them, pushing them into the sea, which is their stated intent. Their intent is not to kill babies. But unfortunately, war, the absence of civility and the population density in that place makes something like that impossible. I think Israel should reject these standards because they are an impossible standard. It's certainly a standard that Hamas itself did not go by, and they are not being reprimanded for genocide, for wantonly going into Israel and murdering, raping, beheading children, the real stuff that savages do. So I categorically reject this verdict. I understand Israel tried to make a case for itself in this kangaroo court. They should not have. They should have categorically rejected the court's authority to pass any verdict on the way in which they defend themselves. I think Israel does too much as it is in its attempt to appease a population who does not understand the nature of war, the nature of self-defense. And they should stop that because they are giving a moral sanction to the victim.
For sure, I think moral sanction.
A moral sanction to the bad guys.
For sure, but I think moral sanctions is an idea which we'll probably end up talking about a fair bit this episode. Robert, I'll come to you as well. What do you think about this?
Yeah, of course, I went back to the definition of genocide. What the hell? You're going to take the one peoples, and I don't usually speak in terms of races, but this is a case where you've got one group of people, not just who have experienced genocide, but for whom the term was invented, the victims of a genocide, and you're going to say, oh yeah, we want to make sure you're not committing genocide after being attacked by an organization in which over 1,000 of your people were killed, over 200 people taken hostages, 5,000 people wounded, and we'll talk more about this as we go on. Fortunately, there are people out there aggregating the videos and the photographs, but especially the video evidence of what happened on October 7th. One of the challenges is you now have October 7th deniers who are saying, well, most of what happened, either Israel was responsible for it or it didn't really happen that way. The idea that this court wants to take the nation, any nation in this situation, but especially Israel, and put them on trial for genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. I'm not even going to read the 5 criterion. They're all valid, except that is the opposite of what is happening here. If anybody was trying to commit genocide, it would be those who attacked the one nation that has already experienced it. So yes, this trial was an outrage to the extent that it could be handled, I can't even say rationally, but handled well. I I am glad that we did not get the kind of condemnation we might have gotten, but it's a farce. The whole thing is it's more than a farce, it's an outrage. That's my answer.
Yeah, it's certainly the ruling today isn't as bad as it could have been, but and we're not going to see the final verdict possibly for another 10 years or something.
Yeah, but
What
Morgan, don't you think that holding Israel to that impossible standard with their criterion is just begging for, the foregone verdict that we know is going to be there anyway?
Oh, for sure. No, no, most definitely. And I don't want to minimize how terrible this is, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But I'm saying in effect that 10 years down the line, since it took about 13 years for them to rule on genocide in Serbia, for example, we're probably just going to see the ruling come out the way we expected to in any case. But Kirk, let's come to you.
Well, I want to respond to what Robert said. There's this comic joke on Elon Musk's website, formerly known as Twitter these days. It's like the meme that says, like, never ask a woman her weight, never ask a man his salary, never ask a critic of Israel what they were saying on October 7th. A lot of the people who now pretend like October 7th never happened were actively celebrating it and defending it when it was happening. But yeah, now people who are throwing around the G word, genocide, they act like October 7th never happened, as if everyone in Gaza was just, peaceful and their government was peaceful, didn't mean no harm, and big bad Israel just decided after that arbitrarily to just go on in and start committing a genocide. And I think it's very telling that the people who are bringing these cases in front of the International Court of Justice are laser focused on Israel and trying to accuse them of genocide and attempt to get a ceasefire or whatever. No one's demanding Hamas do a ceasefire. And I think one of the consequences of this ruling was like, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself, but it should be careful to not kill civilians or whatever. It should still like allow for humanitarian aid. And I'm like, so like were the Hamas militants who were invading and committing terrorism on October 7th, were they like bringing pizza and soda along with them and going to the civilians saying, oh, here's some pizza and soda. By the way, can you point your fingers at the militants because they're the people who were really at war? No, they were just killing innocents in the name of, again, as Mark was alluding to earlier, Hamas is a genocidal organization. And it's I think it's very revealing that the people who like to throw around the G word and try to blame it on Israel really can't blame themselves to do it on Hamas when they're the real genocidal maniacs. They're the one that started this conflict, and all the collateral damage and civilian deaths that are a result of Israel retaliating in self-defense, they are ultimately to blame on Hamas.
Absolutely. And so I think moral sanction is, as Mark mentioned, is one of the key ideas here as to why this is a defeat for Israel. Because even though it could have been worse, it could have been the case that the court recommended an immediate ceasefire, and thankfully that's not what it's done. It wouldn't have any, enforceability even if it had done. But even though this isn't quite as bad, the reason why this is a defeat for Israel is because, in a sense, the defeat's been secured by them engaging with this process in any case. Just as in the same, so, and I think if anyone's kind of resistant to the idea of moral sanction who's watching or anything, the reason why it's important is because if you were to imagine some court in Russia or North Korea or something, some clearly corrupt organization, which required the United States to show up for crimes against humanity or something, you wouldn't even show up because you'd know how ridiculous the whole proceeding was, right? You wouldn't lend it the legitimacy of turning up. And I think in this case, this is exactly the same kind of situation. The UN isn't North Korea or something, although it lends a lot of legitimacy to those kind of countries. But Israel shouldn't even turn up, and that is in a sense Israel's undoing, is the fact that they're engaging with it and they're giving it moral sanction. And what was rather telling was that once this was announced, a representative of Hamas welcomed the decision, and he clearly didn't view it as a defeat, even if South Africa didn't quite get what they wanted. Hamas this representative of Hamas said that what this would do would be to further isolate Israel on the international stage and expose their crimes. And even though I don't think there are crimes to be exposed, I certainly think it's true that this will further isolate Israel, because even the association with genocide, the fact that they're having to engage in this trial, kind of muddies them in the eyes of the international community, and is just a moral outrage. It's insulting that they even have to do it. Everybody knows that it's in bad taste to bring up the idea of the Nazis in connection to Israel, to suggest that Israel, when it's engaging in war, is behaving like Nazis, because that's clearly just designed to rub salt in the wound. And in effect, what this whole proceeding is just a glorified kind of smartened up version of doing that. Everyone's there wearing suits and everyone looks very smart and it's in a nice building, but it's has the same kind of moral standing as a kind of low accusation like that, just like throwing around the Nazis. So Mark is shaking your head. Anything else coming to mind?
I mean, no, absolutely. That's absolutely what it is. People should realize, if you interact with these people on social media, they're so vicious, so mean. They're the types of people in a street fight that would try to bite your nose off and rip your ears off. And then when you put your thumb in their eye and scrape their face along the pavement, cry, they cry because how could you be so savage to me? Look, folks, this stuff should let you know that these people have no conscience. They have no moral compass. And all they care about is winning. And the only way they can win is by you giving up your sense of moral clarity and turning it over to them. And as I was saying in the show last, just a half hour ago, you're inching up to the precipice of doom when the savages have moral clarity and those who stand for civilization don't.
Absolutely. And the fact that it's this representative from Hamas who states clearly that what this is going to do is isolate Israel, when no one else in the Western world seems to be able to point out the clear fact that this is what this is going to do and what it's intended to do, is bizarre. But Robert, let's come to you.
Yeah, the first headline I saw this morning about the story was from the U.S. News and World Report, and their headline was "South Africa Court Ruling Against Israel, a Victory for Rule of Law." And they said the court ordered Israel to prevent acts of genocide against the Palestinians and to do more to help civilians as it wages war against Hamas militants in the Gaza Strip. And I thought, well, that's easy, because the only genocide, the attempt to wipe the Jews from the face of the Middle East, this is precisely what Israel is already doing. They're already fighting that. And, as for what more can it do to help civilians? What more can Israel do beyond working to end the regime that's responsible for the war, for all the death, all the destruction, and of course, I'm going to say, of Israeli civilians, and yes, Gazan civilians too? What more could Israel do? Yeah, Israel was ordered to prevent acts of genocide and do more to help civilians. Well, if that's what you want, wish granted. And it has been since October 7th. And so shut the hell up and go away. That's the answer I have for the court.
Yeah, it's a strange thing seeing. So all the members of the court are these clearly very distinguished, sort of erudite people, and there's something awful about the fact that these people, who in a certain sense have a meaningful job, they're called to kind of preside over the worst crime that there is, really. And, people call genocide the crime of crimes, and yet they're presiding over something which is a complete farce, and which, again, gets the basic veneer of respectability by being associated with the UN. But yeah, anyway, sorry, Kirk, after you.
Well, you were mentioning the UN. Don't we have another story involving international organizations and some controversies involving this conflict between Hamas and Israel?
Do we have another story for today?
Yeah, don't we have another story about how the United Nations, the group that's responsible for bringing relief into Gaza, like some of the members were involved with the October 7th attacks?
I hadn't scheduled it for today, but I did briefly see that in the news. If you want to talk about it, we could absolutely go for it. Absolutely.
Oh, I thought we were going to talk. My bad. But yeah, it's from Felipe
we can do that.
Lazzarini. Okay. The Israeli authorities have provided the UNRWA with information about the alleged involvement of several UNRWA employees in the horrific attacks on Israel on October 7th. To protect the agency's ability to deliver humanitarian assistance, I have taken the decision to immediately terminate the contracts of all these staff members and launch an investigation in order to establish the truth without delay. Any UNRWA employee who was involved in the acts of terror will be held accountable, including through criminal prosecution. UNRWA reiterates its condemnation in the strongest possible terms of the abhorrent attacks on October 7th and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all Israeli hostages and their safe return to their families. These shocking allegations come as more than 2 million people in Gaza depend on life-saving assistance that the agency has been providing since the war began. Anyone who betrays the fundamental values of the United Nations also betrays those whom we serve in Gaza, across the region, and elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, Kirk, I've got to say, you kind of threw me too when you mentioned that. Corruption in the UN. I don't know which story are we talking, but you're absolutely right. When I hear UN, I don't think UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, because the works of that works agency are so anti-West, and in this case, so pro-Hamas, so pro-Palestinian, and not in terms of relief, but in terms of works, in terms of being part of teaching their children the worst idea, the most savage ideas. But you're absolutely right. I didn't think of, no, the UN, what did they do? Oh, UNRWA, United Nations Relief. It's just hard to believe. It's hard to fathom that UNRWA is part of the United Nations. They are so evil, so vicious. And you're absolutely right with the stories coming out. You know, my hope is that the UN will end this organization, or at a minimum, for their own sake, shear it off of the UN, let them have a different name, and for any bastards who want to continue to fund that organization, let them stand in the light and let people see what's going on.
Maybe they should
Yeah.
change the name of the UN to the United Nations Against Israel at this point.
Well, it'd be probably a more accurate description. But the UNRWA story fits in well, actually, and it's something which, you know, is far too little too late. But we've done a lot of videos on the channel about UNRWA, and you know, this is probably the result of a culmination of things. Well, and you mentioned why it was Kirk, but particularly there were stories, for example, that came out in November that it was an UNRWA teacher, or at least one UNRWA teacher, who had held one of the hostages in his attic, for example. And then a few weeks ago, there was the story kind of broken by UN Watch about the Telegram group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers who had celebrated October 7th and who very clearly were kind of indoctrinating the children they were teaching into anti-Semitic stereotypes and all this kind of stuff. So the UN not only kind of provides succor and shelter for these rogue states and provides them with legitimacy in partly through what it's doing today with the court, you know, which we'll circle back around to, but also through the fact that it's using its money that it's taking from its member states and funneling it into organizations like the United Nations Relief Works Administration or agency. And then there's this kind of small print afterwards that's like for Palestine or something, and which is basically perpetuating the conflict for years to come by teaching the anti-Semitic ideas to the next generation. So it is a really good thing today that we've seen that funding has been cut. Of course, as I say, too little, too late, but it's better late than never. Another part of the story, which I don't know if you guys saw, was that tomorrow, obviously, is Holocaust Memorial Day. And it was today that the UN was doing its celebrations. It was kind of doing it a day early. And that was, of course, then portentous, given that this court ruling came today. And there was, so during the speeches which were going on in the chamber where the celebrations were going on, there was everything that was kind of being said in all these speeches about the Holocaust and genocide and so on had this huge association given what was going on. I don't know if did you guys catch any of that, or did you see any of the speeches? No,
I did not.
So it was interesting to watch. So at one point, kind of early on, you know, they have representatives from various organizations. They had Holocaust survivors actually in the chamber with them as well. But the Israeli ambassador stands up, and the Israeli representatives to the UN have all for a number of months now been wearing yellow stars in the chamber to kind of signify that they feel abandoned by this organization. And he stands up and gives this immensely powerful speech. It was really electrifying to hear it because he was really speaking very confidently and with immense kind of moral clarity. And he said in it, the lessons of the Holocaust haven't been learned. And we can see that through people's reactions to October 7th. He condemned the UN for no UN organization having condemned October 7th or having condemned Hamas on October 7th. It was only ever from kind of individual representatives. And then, and he mentions the court ruling that came out today as being a kind of example of the hypocrisy. And he said explicitly, the United Nations has failed in its job. And that was a great thing to see. But there was just this awful kind of contrast, I guess, the fact that the Holocaust Memorial celebration is going on at the same time as Israel is being tried for genocide. And it isn't like, I can imagine some trolls kind of seeing this, or in the chat maybe, who might say something like, well, look, any state can commit genocide. And that's true, but the point is that Israel was founded kind of on the back of genocide, and so it's sort of very attentive to this. And really, there is just no basis for believing that what Israel's doing here is genocide. What it really is just a kind of attempt to dirty up and smear Israel's proper and legitimate attempts at self-defense with a term which is clearly going to sting all the more because of the context and background for Israel's founding. So that's really why this is such a disgrace. But Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that Hamas and this despicable savage movement has working for it is pretty much everybody's been reduced to this concrete bound level of looking at the world. So, you know, if the Hamas Ministry of Health produces numbers out of their ass, like 23,000 people killed, people see the disparity, 23,000 and what, 1,200 Israelis. This must be genocide. They think the number disparity itself is a representation of genocide. They don't stop to think at all about who's the aggressor, who's the defender. None of that matters. They just see the picture, the number disparity, and make judgments from there. And I don't know how you deal with people who are so concrete bound. You can't talk to them about concepts, which is why I think Israel is losing the PR war, because they don't have bromides, they don't have bumper sticker slogans. And the pictures that they show have to be backed up by lots of abstractions and lots of talk about what it is they're doing. Whereas the Palestinians just have to show somebody crying, somebody holding a dead baby, and then blame it on Israel and, disconnect mind, disconnect rational thinking, and go with that. Go with your feelings.
Yeah, I think the phenomena that people are, or the way in which people are having their emotions appealed to in this, I think is something which we're seeing very clearly. If that wasn't a problem that people were aware of before, they should really be able to see it here. That if we, for example, are trying to make a moral case based on principles of self-defense, then all the people have to do is tweet a picture, a really awful picture or a video of children who've been caught up in bomb attacks, and then that's treated as if it's a kind of equivalent kind of argument. When of course we have Peikoff's great lecture, which goes into detail about why that isn't. Robert.
Yeah, in answer to what Mark is saying, because you're right. How do you get through? And I think conversations like this help because we are addressing things in ways that people are thinking about it. You know, if you want to get a better idea what's going on, you could go on YouTube and find some of the great interviews. For example, with Douglas Murray, undeniable, bulletproof statements, all facts and all proper evaluation, but a lot of people won't listen to him. And if they listen, all they will do is get their hackles raised. I think a conversation like this, people who won't listen will listen to this conversation. And two people I'd like you to listen to would be the leaders in this case, because I'll tell you what, some of you, because I had the same reaction, thought, you've got this court and, maybe it's not right that they're doing this trial. but it's just going to shed light on things. It'll just be, light is the best disinfectant. And so we'll get the ICJ to do their thing, and that'll be a good thing. Let me just read two quotes from the Telegraph article. And the first is from Sami Abu Zuri, senior Hamas official. Sami Abu Zuri, a senior Hamas official, said, the ruling would isolate Israel and expose its crimes in Gaza. And he added this, we called for forcing the occupation to implement the court's decisions. Sounds like he's on board with the international community there. And, what they were forced to implement was really trivial. Maybe. No, this is the voice of sanction. This is the voice of the man saying, yes, the court is doing this thing, making us look like we are just one side in a reasonable debate. No, Benjamin Netanyahu, and we've all had our criticisms. I will continue to have criticisms of Netanyahu, but the prime minister criticized the ICJ for listening to these outrageous genocide claims. And his national security minister, Ben-Gvir, said, well, they were silent during the Holocaust, unquote. In other words, during real genocide. If you don't know history, if you don't know the history of World War II, look up the role of the UN. Look up the role of the church. Look up the role of international organizations during World War II and afterward, what they did about the Holocaust, the ways in which they denied it, the ways in which what happened didn't have to happen, at least at the scale that it was happening, without international organizations, without the Catholic Church, and so they're absolutely right. Countless people were silent during the Holocaust, the actual Holocaust, the real genocide. To be having this court doing these things at this time. Again, I was one of the people that said, well, they're going to do what they're going to do. Let's have the trial. Hopefully, they'll rule it. They'll realize that Israel, of course, are the good guys and the aggressors are the bad guys. But no, the very fact that this trial took place is an outrage, as Benjamin Netanyahu, whatever our criticisms, was absolutely right to say. And so I remain outraged. I have a bit of a problem being not objective, but being dispassionate during this conversation. Because fortunately, as I said, you've got Holocaust deniers out there. No, I don't mean the Nazis, although those idiots are out there too. I mean the October 7th deniers. And fortunately, because the same internet that allows them to spread their lies also allows people to put out the evidence, you can actually watch the videos and look at the photographs of what happened on October 7th. And I have seen more of that than I can stomach without even seeing, I've only barely scratched the surface. If you've got the Constitution to be able to watch this stuff, it is out there so that you can be equally outraged when one of your liberal friends or one of your pro-Palestinian friends comes to you and starts saying, well, I don't really think Hamas did everything they say they did. It is all out there. So yes, I am glad to see Netanyahu saying the right things, even if he continues to not necessarily do the right things. And yes, every time Hamas speaks, all you need to do is think critically about what they say, and they tell you exactly who they are and why they need to be defeated.
I think there's a couple of Rand's works we can probably point people to kind of in reference to what you're saying there, Robert. But Kirk, what do you think?
So, Robert, correct me if I'm interpreting it. You said that there are a lot of people were silent during World War II about the Holocaust that was going on, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. You know who was not silent about their intentions during and leading up to World War II was Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Mein Kampf was a bestseller. It was full of insane anti-Semitic ramblings. This is a guy that did speeches that were widely attended and celebrated and widely reported. Then you had the Nuremberg laws and the other mandates from the Third Reich that were meant to oppress Jews, and they were very loud and proud about their intentions. And then going to what Mark was saying earlier about how there's a lot of concrete boundness going on in the world with discussion around this. We even saw this with Ukraine, Russia. A lot of people kind of sat on the fence and just said, you know, war is bad. You know, do I like that Putin is invading Ukraine? No, but we could end the war today if Zelensky in Ukraine just makes compromises, that we won't have war. You see a lot of that same mentality what's going on with Israel and Hamas, and people act like, oh, well, Israel's done enough. The retaliation was disproportionate to what happened to October 7th, to the extent that they actually acknowledged that October 7th happened. Um, and just, oh, let's just bring the war to an end. It's like, well, the Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, they're very loud and proud about how much they hate the Jews and how they want to wipe Israel off the face of the map. And we know if they're ever successful, they're going to impose a much worse form of government than the current state of Israel. They're going to impose Sharia law, and anyone who's left alive in that region, their life is going to be a lot worse. They're not going to have any freedom. And yeah, you're just seeing a lot of this. A lot of people just being evasive of what Hamas's intentions are, and Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Houthis. And they think, oh, if we just if Israel just stops and calls it a day and lets Hamas remain in charge, yeah, we'll stop the war, we'll stop the civilian death. But as we know, if we're evasive about the ideas and the intentions and motives behind genocidal maniacs like Hamas, we know that there will be more terror expected to come in the future.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it wasn't the United Nations that was turning a blind eye to the Holocaust back in the 1940s. The UN was formed, in fact, in response to World War II, but the League of Nations that preceded it did turn a blind eye in too many ways. And Adolf Hitler didn't say, I'm going to kill all the Jews. He just said he was going to solve the Jewish problem. And we didn't fully understand until after World War II just what that looked like. But there were plenty of organizations who knew what was going on, if not the degree to which it was going on. The point is that there is no excuse in 2023/2024 to be turning a blind eye to what is going on in the Middle East and blaming it on the victims, just because the victims happen to be 1,000 times more civilized and consequently 1,000 times more capable of waging in war. That doesn't change the fact that they are the victims and not the aggressors. You know, as Mark pointed out, people like to look at the numbers. Well, look how many more people Israel has killed. Not relevant, not the point.
Yes, and you're right, Robert. The people certainly buried their head in the sand around World War II. Something that Hitler said, I think it was in August or September of 1939, so just on the cusp of the war, as it was clearly leading that direction. He made a speech in which he said, I'm slightly paraphrasing, but I'm getting it mostly right, that if the international financiers and the Jews insist on throwing Europe into war, then they will only ensure their own destruction. So people heard things like that and basically were refusing to see the obvious implication of that. And unfortunately, I think the representative at the UN today was correct in saying that people haven't learned the lessons of the Holocaust, because there are things like that going on today, and people would very much like to bury their head in the sand and say, no, it is Israel that's committing genocide. I'll just read out our super chat since we're just over halfway through. We have $5 from Stephen Harper. Thank you so much, Stephen. $2 from Frank Grail, who says, sad, South Africa, the land of Tolkien's birth, sides with the orcs. That's interesting. I think because all the races in Lord of the Rings are meant to represent different religious groups, aren't they? Maybe the orcs, I think they were meant to be the Muslims. Unfortunately, Tolkien did explicitly say that the dwarves were meant to be the Jews, which of course has a lot of unsavory connotations, but there we go. Atlas Shrugged, $2, says the UN is aptly named and it is just UN or UN. I'm not sure. And then Johnny Ruiz, $5. Thank you so much. And those
Yeah,
are
I gotta say, as silly as Ashley Shrugged's chat comment was, I really appreciated it because they are uncivilized. They are ineffective. They are everything. They are a force for destruction.
I just have to say,
there may be parts of the UN that are doing some good around the world in some small ways as part of charities or relief organizations. They are on balance far more destructive, and they should have been abolished long ago. And as we've said, at a minimum, the United States should throw them out of New York and stop giving them a quarter of their operating expenses.
Ashley Shrugged is the phrase queen. You should go to her Etsy and get t-shirts, pro-capitalist, anti-commie t-shirts, pro-Ayn Rand t-shirts. She designs them, her and her husband, and they are pretty awesome.
I haven't seen those. I'll have to go check those out. Um, I guess something else I wanted to say was just again to give a ringing endorsement to this representative who gave this speech at the Holocaust Memorial today. Not only for the things which he's already said, which were very strong and condemnatory of the United Nations, but towards the end of his speech, if you go watch, I sent a link to it, by the way, to Daniel. Perhaps Daniel can post it in the live chat, and it's about 13 minutes in if anyone wants to go share it. When he gets to a defense of Israel. And what's heartening about it is seeing him defend Israel on a much more proper basis than is sometimes done by the Israelis. Sometimes you get things kind of like, we have a connection with this land going back millennia. It belongs to us. God said so, something like that, which is, of course, hopeless. But this guy stood up and said, Israel is a liberal democratic country, and basically said it needs to be defended against people like Hamas. And whilst we might choose phrases much more like rights respecting, which has respect for individual rights or something like that, although I think liberals, fair enough. We might not choose democratic, but I think that was really encouraging to see that actually the Israeli representatives do have a clear idea of where Israel's moral legitimacy is coming from and on a much more proper basis. And then just to back up, I guess, a lot of the points which we've been saying today around moral sanction, I would have to point people towards, I guess, Rand's essay. I think is it The Anatomy of Compromise, the one where she's talking about some of this stuff. Because basically the idea, which I guess we're articulating, is that in any compromise between good and evil, it's good that loses out. And I'm trying to think where it is that she kind of makes that point. I think it might be in that essay, the essay where she's talking about compromise. I don't know if you guys remember.
I don't remember.
Is it The Anatomy of Compromise, the essay that she wrote?
It's the something compromise. I'm suddenly doubtful whether it's The Anatomy of Compromise, but it's the one where do you remember she gives an analogy about kind of someone breaking into your house and there's kind of no concession that you can make. When she's talking about compromise like that, I think that's the essay which is informing, or the ideas which she expresses in that essay is informing some of what we're talking about here. So maybe that wasn't useful as pointing people in that direction. Okay, Daniel's saying yes, it is the Anatomy of Compromise.
Yeah, I can read that from her personal notes here.
Mm-hmm.
There can be no compromise between a property owner and a burglar. Offering a burglar a single teaspoon of one's silverware would not be a compromise, but a total surrender, the recognition of his right to one's property. Let me see if I can find out exactly where that appeared real quick here. It's from the Intellectual Ammunition Department in the original Objectivist newsletter. And if it became part of one of the anthologies, I don't have that, but it was from the
I think Daniel's
Intellectual Ammunition Department. And it's exactly the point that as soon as you concede somebody's right to commit a crime in the smallest of ways, you've given up, you've abandoned the principle.
Yes, and I think Daniel's saying it's in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And that is what is really at the heart of this point about why Israel shouldn't be engaging with this whole process. Because even if 10 years down the line, the ruling were to come out that Israel hadn't committed genocide, and if even then international leaders said they were very sorry, and South Africa said they were very sorry and whatever, the damage will have been done. And it's the damage being done right now to Israel's reputation whilst it's in a fight for its life, basically.
Its reputation and its morale. I think it's very important for the Israeli people to maintain their morale right now. And even a verdict like this that says we're putting it on hold, but we hold you to these impossible moral dilemmas that you can never possibly fulfill, so that down the line there's going to be the threat of this genocidal conviction hanging over your head. That undoes their spirit, it undoes their sense of moral conviction, and that is evil.
100%. And when the Hamas representative said that this decision would further isolate Israel, there's a sense in which he clearly means on the international stage and in terms of getting it help or funding or support from the US or something like that. But also psychologically, if you're an Israeli, I think probably the more this kind of stuff comes out, the more you must feel isolated from the international community, the more isolated you would feel, like you didn't really have allies on the world stage, even though technically that's very much what Israel does have. But they're not really standing up and defending Israel on the moral battlefield, so to speak, when it counts. Anything else to say, guys? Kirk, Robert, Mark?
Yeah, when talking about to add to what you were saying about isolation, I think like the United States, Blinken has even said that like these accusations of genocide are ridiculous, which is good for him to say, but then he'll kind of go along with a lot of the sentiment that Israel should allow in humanitarian aid and should be helping the civilians and pulling its punches when waging a war. When again, I don't want to see any civilians die in this war, but Israel has to do what it needs to do to defend itself. It shouldn't be pulling its punches, and any collateral damage and civilian deaths are ultimately the responsibility of Hamas for starting this conflict in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be appropriate to put in the description, so I've just shared it to my own Twitter. Some of the websites that are doing the work of maintaining the evidence about October 7th. If anybody hasn't seen these, and if you have the stomach for them, and it's not just videos of the massacre going on, but information about where it happened. There's a website, october7map.com, oct7map.com, where you can see where everything happened, get a better idea of what that morning looked like. That is on my Twitter, twitter.com/Robert Naser.
That's probably a bit of a harrowing read, but that's something I probably will go look at.
Okay,
I can see there
trigger warning.
For sure.
Literal trigger warning.
Yeah. I can see you posted there, Robert, as well. Rand's essay, Doesn't Life Require Compromise? Maybe that was actually the one which I had in mind. Because I tend to be more, because that one's in The Virtue of Selfishness. I tend to be more familiar with those essays than the ones in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So I'd recommend everyone go check out that essay, because she will make the point probably far more eloquently and succinctly than we probably will. Mark, did you have something to say before?
I just think it's important that, we get out there and in social media, as toxic and disgusting as that world is, and give moral support to the Israeli people. As when we can, fight the forces of irrationality and savagery, stand up for what is right. And I've always been of the opinion that one rational person beats a million irrational people. So we can be the lever that pushes the conflict in the right direction if enough people hear us.
Absolutely. And thankfully, although since we were talking about isolation, given how much of the world is anti-Israel and doesn't recognize Israel's moral right to support itself, no matter what they say, thankfully there still are some allies of Israel out there who have articulated how terrible this is. There's not enough, but thankfully it's not a complete. It's not like we're completely shouting in the wilderness about this, even though it sometimes feels like that. Kirk and Robert, anything else?
I think I'm a little too worked up today. I do appreciate it, and as Mark suggests, I think these shows have an important role to fill by having a conversational show about this, by being able to talk about it in these terms. I know that there are people who want to be and now are part of this conversation. I hope we're able to reach people who are still trying to figure out what's going on in these issues. And I know that we're reaching some people who are angry at everything that we say, but by having this type of conversation, I think we can reach them a little bit more, say, than some other folks can do. I think it's an important format. I also want to say thank you to Gail. Since you read the last super chat, she had a super chat come in, and thank you for that. Gail Parker has always been a great supporter of the show as well. I love that we've got, as Jonathan Honig calls y'all, our philosophy posse, the group of kindred spirits, like minds, a lot of us who are coming from the same philosophic base, especially at a time like this, knowing you're not the only person who is shouting what the hell as we see the reaction to what's going on, and keep hoping that Israel will maintain their stance and win this damn war that they didn't start and did not want and are not morally responsible for, but do have the power to end. I hope that they end it ASAP.
For sure. I guess as well, just something which we should say for people, what can people do about the United Nations? Because we spend an awful lot of time on these shows pointing out the moral corruption of the United Nations, how it gives shelter to sort of awful countries out, the rogue states in the world. But very practically, what can they do? Because we can say things like, we need to improve the philosophy, we need to encourage rationality in our culture, and that's completely true. But I always kind of feel a bit bereft when it comes to kind of short-term change. And obviously the change needs to happen very fundamentally in the long term. But do you guys think there's any profit to be gained, for example, about writing to like political representatives, for example, and sort of campaigning against the UN? Do you think there's anything to be gained in doing that? I mean, Mark, you actually technically have a political party. I don't know. I assume the American capitalist platform is probably against funding the UN. But do you think there's anything to be gained from? Do you think there's anything to be gained from like writing to your local representative about this, or is that kind of useless?
They say writing letters like that is a little more effective, but I tend to think that the philosophical and ethical climate in our political world is so arid that I don't know that you'd find any reception for what you do. I think it's better to take the case to the people too. And social media is one place where you can influence quite a few people who may be on the fence and watching the argument from afar. Just the right placed rational words can be the combination that person needs to unlock their rational faculty for this. So, the political system is a little bit it's a rigged game at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And Kirk and Robert, do you think that we can? Is there anything else, I don't know, that you would recommend doing? But do you think you can get anything from writing to politicians and asking them to do something about this?
Yeah, I think it's worth it for its own sake. It gives me additional clarity when I write. But you're right, it also has an impact, just like when we write to them about current events nationally, locally. It does let them know, and in a way that goes a little bit above and beyond just the polls, because 100,000 people is a number, but one person you actually got a letter from, even if it was only one of your staffers who read it and said, oh yeah, we've got 14 people who are pro-Israel and 3 people shouting about it and they're against. So yeah, it has an impact. It's an end in itself, your own sake for your own clarity. I don't know how much impact it has, but it's got to have some. Because I know it does again on local or national events. And Mrs. Nacer could say more about that, having worked with the GOP for a time before they completely fell apart in 2016. She knows the power of people actually showing up. In the United States, we've got the primaries going on, the Republican primaries in particular. And I sometimes wonder, why is Nikki Haley showing up in a room of 16 people? But it turns out actual engagement with actual people in out there in the real world and not just on the internet. But even on the internet, if it's one-on-one, if you're actually engaging with people, more powerful than we know, and you never know which interaction is going to have a massive impact. Even the small ones are good. So I say, yeah, go for it.
Kirk?
Echoing what Robert said, like even just writing your thoughts out is very helpful, can be very clarifying. Often when I'm writing stuff, like I'll write out a sentence or two and then I'll immediately think, wait a minute, there's a fallacy in there, or someone could easily poke this hole right here, and I got to really think about this, or, just organizing thoughts logically. That can be very clarifying for yourself. But then, especially when you think about today's world politically, like writing to representatives, consider that the anti-Israel movement is very loud. They're in streets. I think just the other day when Joe Biden was accepting an endorsement from the UAW, some anti-Israeli hooligans showed up to accuse him of contributing to genocide or whatever. So if that's what we're up against, I don't know if it can hurt to write to your, I don't know how it would hurt to write to your representatives to speak your mind and show them what you think, and show them that, there are still some pro-Israel voices out there. And especially when we're thinking about the United Nations, I keep seeing this talking point going around about how, the United States gives aid and money to Israel. And a lot of people will say like, oh, this is why we don't have free healthcare in America. Just the other day, someone tweeted some meme saying the U.S. gives Israel $10 million a day so that they can have free healthcare and college and whatnot. And that's why but here in America, we can't afford it. One, the math doesn't add up there. If we just save that money, you would still, that would not come near to providing every American with healthcare or whatever. But then it's like, You want to talk about not giving organizations money. Why don't we start with the United Nations? I don't know what the exact number is. I see conflicting reports on how much money the United States gives to the United Nations. I think it's anywhere between $8 and $15 billion a year. If you want to turn off the spigot for international funding, I say we start there, especially when they're, from what I can tell, a reputation laundering scheme for some of the worst people, thugs, and rulers on earth. And yeah, I think it's high time the United States tell them to get bent and stop giving them money. Also, for wrapping up the show today, I do want to add I started the NFL season by saying this, and it might be the last game for the Detroit Lions. So go Lions.
Go Lions. My hometown.
There's something else that just came to mind. One thing we haven't spoken about are the two judges who dissented on this decision. But just something else that came to mind. Something that you mentioned earlier, Robert, was about Netanyahu, who, again, as is so often the case with him, spoke rhetorically very well and condemned this ruling as a farce, and so morally condemned it very strongly. And that's very good. And as with a lot of things surrounding the conflict, he will say things which do sound very good. And yet, of course, the whole problem with it is that he's engaging with it in the first place. As much as it, given that, so the reason why, Israel is subject to this court is because even though they're not a part of the court, they're a signatory to the Geneva Convention, and therefore the ICJ rules on this stuff. So technically, it kind of has jurisdiction over them. But Israel could just refuse to send a delegation. It could just say, this is complete nonsense. We're not going to legitimize this. And that would come down to Netanyahu if he wanted to do that. It would be a big decision. So therefore, it would lie with him. And so something just so disappointing again to see that he rhetorically kind of has the right orientation. And yet when it comes down to kind of the rubber hitting the road, he's completely doing the wrong thing. I wouldn't like to be
it's hard to do that, like when you see this kind of injustice, there's a part of you that says, if I make my case in open court and people hear this reasoning, this rational side of things, they're going to come along. I'm going to appeal to the rational element in everybody out there. But there are lots of people out there now who have no interest in being rational. So first, he has to acknowledge that despite the justice of his case, there are people who are completely closed to the facts. They're completely closed to his case, and they will never be open. But what they will gain is moral sanction from his acknowledging that the argument has to be made in the first place when it really doesn't.
For sure. And then just on those two judges who dissented, one of them was what was called, I guess, an ad hoc judge from Israel. I'm not exactly sure what's ad hoc about it. I don't know if he's just been appointed for this case, as it were. I think his name is Aaron Bahak. I might be getting that wrong. Who he dissented from this decision, but then also the Ugandan judge, whose name is Julia Sebutinde, she's also dissented on all kind of points of this decision. And I guess just since we're condemning this decision so roundly, so we should just point out the good people where they are in this system. I guess another way which we could affect change, although this is going to be fairly difficult, is by getting better people into positions of power within an organization like the UN. It would probably be better if the UN kind of wrapped up shop and was replaced by something else. But if you were to see more people like this, who were good people in positions of power in the UN, who, when they saw the UN doing the thing that the UN so often does, which is to provide sanction and shelter for disgusting rogue states, or when the UN engaged in the persecution of a just state like Israel, who didn't allow it to happen, or even though she can't stop it, who stood up and said so when it was going on. So we should, stand up and mention this lady's name and praise her because she's done a good thing today. And then just the final thing, Kathleen gave £3 as a super chat. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Any final comments, guys, just as we're drawing to the final few minutes of the show?
I think if anybody in Israel, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, again, because I understood the perspective of people who disagree with the trial but are glad to see the result, I totally get it. I consider me, one of your kindreds in that regard. Even though I'm outraged that it took place at all, it could have been worse. And it's sad to live in a world where I've got to say, but I do. It could have been worse.
Mhm. And Mark?
If anybody in Israel is watching this, I just want them to know that there are people who understand where they're coming from to keep up their morale, to stay strong, and to see this conflict to the end, which means the total destruction of Hamas and Hamas-like ideologies in that region. If you want peace, if you want war to end, you need a resounding victory. And I'm with you. I'm with you.
Here. Kirk, anything final?
Yeah, since we've been throwing around the G word today, I want to echo Mark's point that, yeah, Hamas, they're a bunch of genocidal maniacs, and go Israel, continue to give them hell, and go Lions.
Absolutely. And I'll just join in that for anyone Israeli who's watching. I, in a sense, very sorry that I think probably the Hamas representative is right that this decision would probably lead to Israel feeling more isolated on the international stage. And whilst we aren't nations here, to the extent that we can offer our support and our camaraderie, we're with you guys, and we're very sorry that this is happening. But all right, guys, thank you for joining me today. Daily Objective will be on tomorrow. The reality show won't. But for channel members and members of ARC UK, we have TRS Extra on Sunday coming up as well. So we'll see you all then. And thank you so much for joining me. And we'll see you later.